These slides were organized by Dr. Alemi. In these slides, we point out that the control limits can be calculated from either pre- or post-intervention time periods. This results in two different control limits, and one has to choose the limits that are tighter, less spread from each other. Let's go over some of the definitions of terms here. Control charts are based on comparing observations for each time period to control limits. Here the red line shows the control limits, the blue line shows the observations. If you make a change and intervene in the process, you can see if the change has affected the outcomes. The change creates two time periods, the first pre-intervention and the other post-intervention. Then you can compare post-intervention observations to projected pre-intervention limits. If any point falls outside the limits, you may then conclude that the intervention has changed the outcomes. The solid line shows the time period used to set the limit. The dashed line is an extrapolation of the limit to other time periods. If there is an intervention, one must collect the limits from data prior or following the intervention. It's not reasonable to use all of the data to calculate the control limits. Compare the chart in the left to the chart on the right. Both are based on the same data, but in right, limits are based on the first 7 days before the intervention. The chart on the right shows the post-intervention data are lower than the lower control limit, and therefore a significant change has occurred. More points are lower than the lower control limit in the chart to the right than the chart to the left. By setting the limits to pre-intervention patterns, we were able to detect more accurately the improvements since the intervention. Control limits can be calculated from pre-intervention period and extended to the post-intervention period. Or we could do the reverse. Control limits can be calculated from the post-intervention period and extended to the pre-intervention period. Either way, we are comparing the two periods against each other. But since the results will radically differ, it's important to judiciously select the time periods from which the control limits are calculated. The selection depends on the inherent variability in the pre- or post-intervention periods. Control limits are calculated from the time period with least variability. Typically, this is done by visually looking at the variability in the data or at the range of the data in pre- and post-intervention time periods. This chart shows the control limits derived from pre-intervention data. The control limits are calculated from the pre-intervention period and shown as a solid red line. They are extended to the post-intervention period, shown as a dashed red line. This control chart compares the observations in the post-intervention period to the control limits derived from the pre-intervention period. This chart shows the reverse. It shows the control limits for the same data drawn from a post-intervention data. Note that this time around the control limits are calculated from the post-intervention period, shown as a solid red line. They are extended to the pre-intervention period, shown as a dashed red line. This control chart compares the pre-intervention observations to the control limits calculated from the post-intervention data. Note that both analyses are based on the same data. Both analyses compare the pre- and post-intervention data by contrasting the observations in one period to the control limits derived from the other period. In one case, the control limits are drawn from the pre-intervention period and in the other from the post-intervention period. Note the radical difference of the control limits derived from the two time periods. In this case, the post-intervention control limits are further apart than the pre-intervention control limits. Therefore, we need to select the pre-intervention period to estimate the control limits. Another way of doing this is based on the concept of forced spread, which we will define in later slides. Select pre or post-intervention limits that have less spread.